So hope everybody had a good 4th. We'll get started here in a minute or so. For those of you that are not familiar or have not read up on the big beautiful bill, as it's been called, I'm going to do a quick analysis of how it may affect you tax-wise. There's some big benefits, especially in blue states. So those of you here in California should have a nice tax benefit. Just a reminder, we are recording. Go ahead and flip all the topics up there. So we'll talk about the market, the Fed, the treasuries, alternate investments, the economy, and then again, we're going to cover that big beautiful bill in our takeaway today. S&P 500 continues to rise. Again, the underlying valuations of stocks are not getting better. They're getting worse. So there's two ways that gets fixed. Either earnings go up or values go down. So it's likely that we'll have a combination of the two along the way as we're having more investment in the US. But as it stands, we keep going up on the stock market. For treasuries, we have yields again at about, we had a dip in yields, which means prices go up right at the end of June, beginning of July. We're having a lot of talk about interest rates being cut again. In fact, Powell came out and said, likely not in July, but in the next meeting, they'll consider a cut much more likely. And that's in a presentation he gave to a bunch of bankers. Okay. So Congress passes Trump's sweeping domestic policy bill. Again, we'll touch on that. It should behoove everyone on the call. There should be benefits for everyone here. It's right now, if you look at the numbers just strictly based on the bill itself, it would create a deficit, which is revenue from taxes would be dropping, so it wouldn't pay for itself. But we can talk a little bit about how growth offsets that. The Federal Reserve Chair sent strong message on July interest rate cut. So he said probably not in July, but in the next meeting, as I mentioned. So we're stable at that middle ground, basically, on what the Fed's going to do. I think we'll see that move up over the next couple months. And by the way, the Fed came out recently, or pardon me, a report came out recently that showed for every interest rate that the Fed cuts, it saves more than $300 billion in interest per year on the debt that we have. So if we cut 2 percentage points, that's $600 billion a year, which is more than 10% of the revenue that's received from taxes and would more than offset the new bill. So it would cover the cuts there. Okay, so trueflation, this is actually ticked down to 1.66 as of today. One of the big items in the media was that if these tariffs continue to go through, we'd see outrageous inflation. What we've seen is if you look at January on this chart, you'll see that's a peak. When Trump came in, inflation was at 2.86%. We're now at 1.66%. So we're continuing to trend lower. And this is one of the reasons I do expect that the Fed is going to cut rates soon, because their big fear was inflation. And it seems to be less and less of a fear going forward. Gold, it's down over the last month or so, but if you look at the last 6 months, it's up 24%. I do expect that the trend will continue up, but at a much slower pace than we saw in the first 3 months. So you'll see the fairly steep incline over the first 3 or 4 months. And then it's kind of leveled off and is setting new highs occasionally. So I do expect that will continue, but at that slower rate. Similar with silver, you'll see silver actually was a steeper curve in the last part of the chart. And we discussed this in the last call, but both are good hedges against the market decline. You want to have both in your portfolio. Okay, so we've talked about this a few times. There's 5 areas to fix the economy. Tariffs, the news came out, they were going to be horrible. So far, knock on wood, they've actually, other than adding 100 billion in revenue to the US to date, and likely 300 billion through this calendar year. They haven't caused the inflation that everybody worried about. That's not to say that it won't happen in the future, but we've got a pretty good track record now of it not affecting inflation. Tax cuts, the bill just came out. For the most part, the biggest thing is keeping the tax rates where they are, rather than having them revert back to where they were 10 years ago. That would have been a huge tax increase for everybody. But there are a few others, like no tax on tips for seniors, getting an extra $6,000 standard deduction to offset Social Security income and the tax you would potentially pay there. Deregulation, which we're seeing cuts in government, in the regulation departments. So we're seeing it being easier to do business. We're having a lot of companies move into the country, a lot of investment in the country. Reduction of wasteful spending. That's the Doge piece. Some of that spending was just included in the big, beautiful bill. I'm just going to call it the BBB going forward, so I'm not wasting everybody's time. But some of that was written into the new bill. And then interest rates and Fed policy. That's the one piece that has not moved forward yet. And that's one of the big pieces for paying down the debt. So if we get the Fed to start working in Americans' favor and reducing interest rates, that will allow us to start paying off our 38 trillion in debt. Okay. So specifically about the BBB, standard deduction has gone up. It's not a big step up. It's just based on inflation, really. So you can write off a little bit more of your income. The bonus deduction for seniors, so they added 6,000, and that's again to offset the amount of Social Security income that you would normally be taxed on. So you get to keep an extra 6,000, and that's all based on your Social Security and all of that. State and local tax deduction. So you may remember, for those of you on the call last time, we talked about how the last bill that went through 10 years ago created higher taxes for a lot of folks in California and blue states, because it limited the amount of tax deduction you could have based on your state and local taxes. So, and that's called the SALT deduction. So that $10,000 limit has now been moved up to 40,000. So for most of us who own a home here in San Diego, your property taxes alone are more than the 10,000. So you were not including your income tax from California. You were losing a lot of deduction. So now that limit's gone up to 40,000. This should help a bunch of people on this call and actually reduce your taxes going forward. Let's see, child tax credit. This is not a huge one, but increase the value of the child tax credit. Estate and gift tax. I don't think this will affect anybody on this call unless you plan on living another 30 years. The estate tax and gift tax limits have gone up. Okay, tax on tips. Again, I don't think this affects anybody on this call, but you can deduct up to 25,000 in tip income. So no taxes for those folks. Overpay up to 12,500. Now, the one caveat here is, for example, if you make $15 an hour normally and your overtime pay is, say, time and a half, so you add $750 to that, it's only the $750 that is not taxable. So it's not the full overtime amount, it's just the excess overtime amount that's not taxable. So that's an important thing to understand for those that are going to deduct that overtime pay. Auto loan interest, this is one that may affect some folks here. You can now deduct interest on auto loans for purchases between 2025 and 2028. A big one for some of your kids that may be having grandkids for you is $1,000 credit to an account where when you're born, you get that $1,000, it starts working for you, and parents can do up to $5,000 contribution per year as a tax deferred contribution. So that'll help with their taxes. I'm not exactly sure the rules on how that money has to be used or by when and when it becomes the child's money, but we can look into that and get some more detail. But it's a good benefit for kids because the sooner you start, the faster it grows. So that's a good benefit there. Charitable deduction for non-itemizers has been adjusted as well. And that's kind of it. But everyone on these calls should be affected in one way or another. The SALT deduction is the biggest one and have huge effects for everybody going forward for 2025 taxes. Any questions about any of that? And again, you guys are
Matt.
Yes.
Matt, just real quick, the SALT deductions, again, what all does that include?
So SALT stands for state and local tax.
Okay. So that's not, okay.
Yep. So it's any taxes that you're paying in California or whatever state you're in. Yep.
So any kind of property tax, or is that state income tax?
So the property tax would be counted in that.
Okay, that's part of the SALT. That's when you're talking about SALT. Yep. Okay.
Now in Florida, it may not affect you much because you don't have the state income tax. So, but for example, here in California, property tax is more than the 10,000 limit. So, and then you have state income tax on top of that.
Right.
Matt, does the BBB eliminate federal taxes on Social Security?
No, but it gives you a deduction of $6,000 if you're 65 and over that should offset the amount of taxes you pay on your Social Security. Yep. So it's not a direct elimination of taxes. It's an indirect extra deduction to seniors.
Matt?
Yes.
Is the 1,000 deductible from Social Security, is there a limit to your income where you don't qualify?
Yes. I don't recall the amount.
Okay.
But I believe it starts to phase out at about 100,000 of income, but I can confirm that.
Okay.
Yep.
Matt?
Yes.
How does the increase in the deficit with this package affect the big picture?
Sure. I said I'd get back to that and then I forgot to do it. So thank you for reminding me. So if you look at the various bodies that have reviewed this bill, and most of them have some sort of political affiliation, the ones that are on the red side are somewhere between it's a positive, meaning we're paying off the deficit, to it's a minor deficit, meaning up to 1.2 trillion a year of extra spending. If you're looking at the blue side, you have around 3.6 trillion in deficit, depending on how you're looking at it. In both cases, they're accounting for growth within the economy at different rates. So the kind of the middle ground that I found was a growth rate or GDP growth rate of about 1.2%. So that is a very reasonable growth rate considering the path we've been on the last 4 years, but it might be a very small growth rate compared to some of the things that are occurring. So for example, we've got over 7 trillion in commitments to businesses creating factories, creating jobs here in the US. We've got over 1.5 million jobs created in the last 6 months, which creates more tax revenue. So we have all these different things that are not being accounted for. They're not accounting for the tariff income, the 300 billion expected for this year. So there's a lot of factors that we just can't know until we know. But if you look at the bill as a standalone bill, it looks like by itself, with the tax decreases and the 1.2% growth rate, that it's about a billion and a half a year deficit. So that's the bill itself, not including everything else. So if you add in expenses being cut and other things, it could actually be neutral or better.
I have a question, Matt.
Sure.
In everything I've read or seen or heard, no one has addressed the, everybody talks about more jobs, more jobs. Has anybody included all the jobs that were eliminated through the thousands of people who have lost their jobs? Has anybody calculated that into, about or see about is people losing jobs? I really don't see a lot of people gaining new jobs. What am I missing?
Yeah, so each month the Labor Department comes out and announces the jobs that have been created. They do account for jobs that have been lost. So they do offset that. If you look at, I haven't seen the government versus private payroll report, but my guess is you'll see government jobs going down and private payroll jobs going up. And an interesting thing I did see this month is there's been over 2 million jobs added for US born workers and over 500,000 jobs that have been lost for non-US born workers. So if you look at the stats, that generally will mean a much higher tax revenue for those jobs. So again, I don't know exactly how any of this is going to play out. We can't know. We don't have a crystal ball to see exactly what it's going to do. But what we do know is we can look at the trends, and job numbers are going up, inflation is going down, and there's a significant amount of investment in the US, those are all positive things for a strong economy going forward.
Matt, this may not be something you know, but do you know if this big beautiful bill thing had any effect on employee retention credit? I'm still been waiting like 3 years for a large check I was supposed to have gotten. So.
Yeah, I don't know. In all the analysis I did, I saw nothing regarding that. So I don't know if it wasn't included or it's just a minor piece.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, as far as I last knew, they were still slowly starting to do them, but it's been slow to say the least. So.
Yeah, I know. I started the process at one point and was like, okay, that's a lot of work. And they were 2 years behind at the time.
Yeah.
I wouldn't count on it. And if you get it, I'd be ecstatic.
I will be.
Anything else? I appreciate you guys
any recommendations that you have as far as things we should be looking at as investments for this year?
Yeah, I think at this point, the big investment you should be looking at is long-term treasuries. I think that's going to be the big winner through the end of this year. There are certainly other positions that specific to AI and cryptocurrencies and things like that I think will do well, but I wouldn't be surprised if they're lower than they are now at some point in the future. So I think treasuries are the long-term treasury funds specifically are kind of at or near their bottom. And so as you accumulate those where they are now, you should see some appreciation as well as the 4.5% to 5% current yield that they're paying. I think that's a good place to be.
In the past, you've talked about warding off recession. Do you think we've been successful in doing that?
I don't know. So there's a couple things that I would say about that. One, I do think the stock market is going to come down. And that does not necessarily mean a recession. I did think that there would be a lag between the policies that the current administration are putting in and them actually having some positive effect on the economy. I thought there would be a significant 6 to 12-month period where we'd have a potential recession. So far, knock on wood, that has not been the case. That being said, I could see, in an effort to get interest rates to be reduced, creating an artificial recession to kind of force the hand of the Fed, but also create a flight to safety from the stock market to the bond market to get interest rates down, to get the effective interest rate down on long-term treasuries. So refinancing and basically creating an extra 300 billion of revenue per 1% of reduction in interest rate, that would be huge towards paying off that deficit. So all of that being said, I don't know where we're going to go as far as a recession, because it could be that consumers decide that things aren't working at any point, and that could push us into a recession. People stop spending, but so far that hasn't been the case.
Thanks.
All right.
We'll talk to you guys soon.
Okay.